Okay, we've got a lot of hurricane preparedness questions to answer today, so please welcome Katie Goen.
Thank you, Don. I'm happy to be here to moderate today's discussion. And to get things started, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Jason Moreland, in-house senior meteorologist at Alert Media. He graduated from the University of South Alabama with a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology with a focus on industrial meteorology. His professional experience within the private sector includes more than 8 years of extensive domestic, international, and offshore forecasting. Throughout his career, Jason has provided critical decision support to a wide range of businesses, live event venues, and sensitive utility and offshore projects ahead of impending hazardous weather. Hi, Jason. Thanks for being here.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to having an open table discussion with you about the upcoming hurricane season.
Wonderful. And we also have Sarah Pratley joining us today. Sarah is Vice President of Global Intelligence at Alert Media, where she leads a team of experienced analysts to monitor emerging threats and incidents around the world. And prior to joining Alert Media, Sarah was Vice President of National News for CNN's domestic news gathering unit. She led the network's coverage on a number of major events, including the Boston Marathon bombings, Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, numerous destructive natural disasters, and more. During her decade at the network, Sarah gained a unique ability to assess and analyze and decipher information quickly, which she now applies to her role at Alert Media. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Katie. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion and all the great questions I know are coming at us.
Wonderful. Well, we are honored to have you today. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Alert Media, I just wanted to give a short overview of who we are and what we do. So our mission has been the same since day one, to help our customers save lives and minimize loss in the face of critical events. So to do that, we've developed a modern, sophisticated solution to help organizations communicate efficiently and effectively during a wide range of emergencies. So we help our customers by supporting their employee safety and emergency response initiatives, their business continuity planning, disaster recovery, and more. So we offer 3 key solutions, the first of which is our global threat intelligence. And that helps you identify threats near your people and near your locations faster through automated impact assessments and real-time warnings. And we also have our emergency communication software. So that will help you communicate quickly and effectively during emergency events with multi-channel notifications and also 2-way features. So that allows you to interact with your people and confirm their safety, which is key. And then finally, we have our employee safety monitoring tool. And those capabilities are backed by a 24/7, 365 monitoring team. And they will provide assistance and support to your employees, either when they signal for help through our mobile app or through a dedicated emergency line. So that's just a little bit about Alert Media. And before we get into the presentation, I would like to take a moment to poll our attendees today. So this will just give us a better understanding of where your primary concerns lie as we get deeper into hurricane season. So if you want to go ahead and share those now, Dawn, that would be great. So just take a moment here to fill out the question on your screen, and you can select as many of these answers as you like. It doesn't have to just be one. So the question is, what are your company's primary concerns for the 2021 hurricane season? Is it property or facility damage, protecting your on-site employees, protecting dispersed or remote employees, communication, and that can be before, during, or after a storm, or business continuity concerns? So I'll give that just a couple more seconds if you could go ahead and get your responses in now. And then Dawn, I will ask you to go ahead and share those results if you would, so that we can all have a look at them. Okay, so pretty even across the board on the top three, but then the biggest results seem to be the communication and the business continuity. So let me ask you, Jason, is this surprising at all to you based on what you're seeing and hearing out there?
I would say no surprise at all. Often leading up to these significant storms, there's going to be widespread concerns about business continuity, not just with regard to where the exact track is, but even far away from where the center is expected to make landfall. As we all know, that these storms are large, significant, widespread storm systems that can impact multiple states at once. So logistics and supply chain are going to be just a few of the major concerns that we can have leading up to these systems.
Gotcha, that makes sense. And what about you, Sarah? Anything surprising here to you?
I don't think surprising, but definitely, the communication before, during, and after the storm definitely, strikes you that that's obviously a major concern to folks, especially in the time that we're living in right now. I think we mentioned it earlier, the disparate workforces, right? We've got people all over the country, all over the globe. So definitely being able to effectively communicate with people, definitely high priority on the list all across the board.
Absolutely. Well, perfect. So before I pass things over to Jason, who's going to talk about what to expect from this year's hurricane season, just want to remind everyone that this is an interactive webinar. So if you do have a question about a slide that you're seeing or the topic that's being discussed, you can either go ahead and ask it at that time, or later in the program, we will have a more formal Q&A. So it's up to you on when you'd like to submit those. All right, Jason, take it away.
Yeah, so good afternoon once again, everyone. I think what would be best right now is just dive into some of the more recent seasonal hurricane forecasts, just so that we can get a better gauge as to what sort of magnitude season that looks to be headed our way. So just to kind of start off, this was the Noaa forecast published during the latter part of May. And you can see on the right-hand portion of the screen, they're forecasting a range of 13 to 20 named storms, 6 to 10 of which are expected to become hurricanes, and 3 to 5 of those are likely to become major hurricanes. This is a significant forecast because even when you kind of account for the more recent active period that we've been in since the mid-1990s, the new 30-year average, the season average for those numbers are 14, 7, and 3. So across the board, we're expecting average to more than likely above average counts of named storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes. And another thing I would just also like to point out here, toward the left-hand side of this graphic, you can see some of their early on projections for the 2019 and 2020 hurricane seasons. And if anything, especially for last year, the forecast was kind of underdone, so to speak. We saw a lot of favorable conditions really come together, especially during those busier peak months of August, September, and October. So 2020 kind of blew expectations out of the water with 30 named storms, 14 hurricanes, 7 major hurricanes. Fortunately, it doesn't look like it's going to be quite as severe of a season compared to 2020. But the biggest thing that I want to mention is that it doesn't take another 2020 or even 2005 type hurricane season for it to be a terrible season for businesses. All it takes is one significant storm to impact your business to make it a bad one. So that's the Noaa forecast. And on the next slide, we'll see an updated forecast from Colorado State. This is actually the most recent one that was issued just within the last couple of weeks. So their new predictions for 2021, we're looking at 18 named storms, 8 of which becoming hurricanes, and 4 of those likely to turn into major hurricanes. So this kind of coincides fairly well with what we're seeing from NOAA. We have some pretty good agreement from 2 of the biggest weather forecast agencies when it comes to seasonal hurricane forecasting. And you see the trend with regard to their 2019 and 2020 forecast. If anything, the numbers have been kind of underdone before we get into the peak of the season the last couple of years. And I will say anecdotally, just kind of based on what we've already seen just within the last 45 days or so across the Atlantic, Gulf, and Caribbean, I would not be surprised, especially with regard to the total named storm count, that we get closer to that 20 named storm range once again, or the upper end of what some of these early season projections are looking like. So with that, kind of, just kind of foreshadowing what we were just discussing here, this is one of the latest tropical weather outlooks for the next 5 days issued by the National Hurricane Center. And this picture that we're seeing out there today is more reminiscent of what you could usually expect to see during the month of September. The Hurricane Center is monitoring no less than 3 systems, one of which is a tropical wave that has come off the African coastline within just the last few days. Typically, the Eastern Atlantic is monitored more so for development as we get towards what we consider to be the peak Cape Verde hurricane season, getting into mid to late August, early September. So to see well-defined waves coming off Africa this early in the season, that could be a telltale sign that the African wave train, which is the main development source for a lot of tropical systems, is likely to be more energetic than normal this year. So that is one of the things that we're kind of looking at. Luckily, that system is kind of unlikely to develop. There's only about a 10% chance over the next 5 days, but interest across the Eastern Caribbean should still keep a loose eye on things in the event that the forecast changes. And then as we look towards areas off of the US Eastern Seaboard, we already have our second named storm of the season. As you may remember, we had Tropical Storm Ana developed just to the northeast of Bermuda in late May. That was actually the 7th year in a row that we've seen early season activity. And as far as Bill is concerned, it's no threat to the US, but it could impact portions of Newfoundland, Canada, with some gale force winds and some elevated rainfall, nothing too significant. But the biggest thing I want everyone to focus in on, especially for interests out there across the Southeast US, this is actually some breaking information. We have an updated tropical outlook from the Hurricane Center that just came out within the last 15 minutes or so. We're now up to an 80% chance of development within the Southwest Gulf of Mexico. This is mainly going to be for the Thursday into Friday timeframe. That's when conditions are likely to become a little bit more favorable. The good news right now is that conditions don't look like they're favorable for this to rapidly intensify into anything significant like a hurricane, but at the same time, we all know, interest along the Gulf Coast at least, that tropical storms can cause significant flooding, heavy rainfall, and things of that magnitude. So Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I would say be on the lookout anywhere from the mid to upper Texas coast eastward through the Florida Panhandle and even portions inland. We still don't have a very well-defined trackable system yet, but it looks like there's definitely going to be some heavy rainfall and likely some flood watches issued within the next couple of days. So it's already getting active out there, and we're watching it here at Alert Media. So how has hurricane season changed over the last few years? So as I was kind of referring to when we were looking at those forecast numbers for the rest of the year, we're kind of comparing those accounts to the new 30-year standard, which better accounts for the more active period that we've been in since 1995. So the average is now 14 named storms and 7 hurricanes, which is up from what we've seen in prior decades. And then a new change that has been implemented going into this season is that the Greek alphabet has been retired. So we've seen in 2020 and also 2005, we ran out of named storms, or the list of names, because we had just so many storms out there throughout the year. We then would usually go into the Greek alphabet, but what we've come to find is that it becomes confusing because we can't really reuse these same names over and over again every 6 years, especially for those major hurricanes that we oftentimes will retire the names for to reduce any sort of confusion and things of that nature. So there's actually a secondary backup list, so we'll never have to use the Greek alphabet again. And then, as I was saying earlier, we're seeing more of these early season developments with minimal tropical storms. So tropical weather outlooks, the outlooks that are issued daily that kind of signal for any signs of development over the next week, issued by the National Hurricane Center, those usually start on June 1st, but beginning this year, they actually moved up that date to May 15th because we're seeing so many early formations. They want to start these outlooks ahead of time to get ahead of the curve here. And then the potential start of the season may, in fact, be bumped up from June 1st to May 15th in upcoming years. A formal decision hasn't really been made on that yet, and I think they're going to revisit this as we head into the off season ahead of 2022. But it's certainly plausible with these additional early season developments that we'll see that get bumped up to May 15th. And then another thing I would like to talk a little bit more in depth about is we are seeing improved track and intensity forecasts as we go from, especially not just year to year, but decade to decade. That's when it becomes much more obvious. And we'll show a brief example of how the forecasts have improved just within the last 10 to 15 years.
And real quick, Jason, a couple of people already want to know, with this improved tracking system, are you able to tell people where in the country is most likely to be hit by a hurricane this year?
So unfortunately, there's no way to definitively say well in advance regions that are going to be directly impacted. But what we can say is that there is at least a loose correlation between above average hurricane seasons in terms of named storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes, and the probability of major coastal regions being impacted by these devastating storms. So for example, Colorado State, they don't project definitive areas of where landfalls are going to be, but they kind of compare the chances of a landfall compared to the climatological average. So usually the continental US will have about a 1 in 2 chance of a major hurricane landfall. And for this year, there's nearly a 70% chance that a major hurricane will strike somewhere within the US. And that's for at least one major hurricane. And it definitely wouldn't take much if the pattern is there for a few weeks to see more than one. Hopefully we don't get that, but it's certainly something we cannot rule out.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So this is somewhat of this comparison that I wanted to talk about with regard to the improvements of track forecasts. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen was the 5-day forecast back in 2005 for what was Tropical Depression 18. Everyone that lives along the upper Texas and western Louisiana coast will be very familiar with this storm, though, because it later became Major Hurricane Rita. And this is just a comparison to show you the difference in the 5-day forecast cone size back in 2005 compared to what we're looking at more so around 2020 and then heading into 2021. So the 5-day forecast error for storms dating that far back was often nearly between 250 and 300 nautical miles. And they based the cone size based on what the 5-year track average error was. So it's not really so much where the storm is going to be in terms of size, but in terms of the forecast error in relation to where the center of circulation is going to track. And over the years, through the advancements with better forecast models, satellite data, better information coming from the hurricane hunters, the 5-year average track error has decreased substantially. So for 2019 and 2020, it wasn't uncommon for the 5-day forecast tracks to have an average error rate under 150 nautical miles. So as we see here on the example on the right with Hurricane Laura, even though the storm was basically going to end up hitting the same area as Rita back in 2005, we've seen a drastic decrease in the cone size. So we've got increased confidence with regard to the forecast. But while this picture is up, I also wanted to really key in on a few other points. The cone is not an indication of where the outward extent of major impacts are going to be. The cone is simply the best guess as to where the center of circulation is going to end up. And in addition to that, there is about a 1 in 3 chance on average that the center will move outside of the cone at some point throughout the duration of the forecast. So even if you're not necessarily within that 5-day cone, it's very important to keep up with the day-to-day and even hourly changes with regard to the forecast, because there will be additional adjustments. This is certainly not set in stone. And even if you're just outside of the cone, you could still be impacted by significant tropical storm force or higher winds, coastal storm surge, or excessive rainfall.
So Jason, we're already getting a couple questions about this. You know, I'm nowhere near the coast, I'm more inland. Do I need to be concerned about hurricanes? So
yeah,
people
absolutely.
want to know.
Yeah, we've seen this time and again, especially the last few years with storms that have produced significant impacts well away from the point of landfall. This was a notorious storm back in 1999, but there's been plenty of recent examples of this. But Hurricane Floyd back in '99 was a notorious storm for communities across the Carolinas. This was a record-setting rainfall event, at least at the time. But even as it weakened and advanced well into the mid-Atlantic and Northeast, you're seeing widespread rainfall totals in excess of 10 to 15 inches, widespread power outages. So, and also this is well removed, well north and west of the center, even as it weakened, going straight through the mid-Atlantic and much of the Northeast US. Another perfect example, who could forget this, especially if you're within the upper Texas coastline. Hurricane Harvey dumped unprecedented levels of rainfall. There was a 60-inch maximum, not 16, but 60 inches of rainfall recorded within Southeast Texas. Basically, the storm stalled out over Southeast Texas for a week. And a lot of times people think of hurricanes as being these gigantic windstorms, which of course they are, but it's really going to be the powerful impacts of water that are the most life-threatening. So we saw that in vivid detail across the Houston metro area. But this is also just driving home the point that although all the eyes were rightfully so on Texas, several days later, even a week after the storm made landfall, look at Tennessee and Kentucky. Widespread flooding, there were widespread evacuations across some of these towns across Tennessee and Kentucky. So even if you have interest across the Tennessee Valley, lower Ohio Valley, mid-Atlantic region even, you know, you may not think of any kind of concern for a storm coming your way, you know, when it's starting in Texas, but certainly we've seen this repeatedly over recent years, especially. So be on the lookout if you hear about these storms offshore, even if you're several states inland. And Sarah, I think you can probably touch on this one better than I can, but this was one of our storms from the 2020 season. So it made landfall. This is going to be Hurricane Zeta that impacted Southeast Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. We saw widespread power outages. It was just an awful year for much of the Gulf Coast. They were getting hit repeatedly by tropical storms and hurricanes. But if you look at some of these statistics in the top left-hand corner, you're seeing some of the biggest outages far inland. We're talking Atlanta, Georgia, upper portions of South Carolina, and this extended well into Virginia, even extending off of this map. And in total, at one point, we had over 2 million people without power, and many of these people without power were far removed from the coastline.
Yeah, I was in Georgia at the time, and it was definitely a sight to be seen, just with the power outages and the damage. I was telling you guys the other day, I got a new roof because of that, for better or for worse.
So one of the things I wanted to kind of review here is we're kind of talking about how we're expecting a very above average season. So what are some of the parameters behind the scenes that are leading forecasters to believe that this is going to be another active to potentially even hyperactive type year? So first off, you know, this probably looks like, you know, some watercolor painting that you have no idea what you're looking at, and just bear with me because this is a really important feature out here within the equatorial Pacific. So within this map, you're looking at sea surface temperature anomalies in Celsius. So the main area that we're focusing on is the water region just to the west of South America. And if this were an El Nino type year, you would see those oranges and reds really showing up. And that would be a signal that we're looking at widespread El Nino type conditions. And the reason why we're always looking to see if an El Nino is out there is because it results in enhanced thunderstorms across the central and eastern Pacific. But on the downside, it actually produces more in the way of wind shear, unfavorable wind shear, and dry sinking air across the Gulf, Caribbean, and Atlantic. And dry sinking air and increasing wind shear are the exact opposite of what tropical storms and hurricanes like to see. So the fact that we are dealing with a lack of an El Nino is a net positive for development. And then another thing I'll say is that we're coming off of a winter La Nina, and that winter La Nina episode still has its footprint within the global atmospheric weather pattern. So even though it's kind of like a neutral state, we're still seeing the impacts of that winter La Nina within the weather conditions that we're seeing on a global scale. And there's even some indications that although it's going to be neutral ENSO conditions out there through August, September, and October, we could still be dealing with weak La Nina type effects all the way through the summer and even into the fall months. Second thing I would just like to point out really quick, the water temperatures in the Gulf, Caribbean, and Atlantic are not quite as warm as what they were last year. So with any luck, maybe we won't see the total number of storms and hurricanes get anywhere close to what we saw last season. But even having said that, the Gulf, Caribbean, and Atlantic still look to be well above normal. And this is just another major reason why we're expecting an above average count of storms.
Great. Well, let's toss it over to Sarah now, who's going to discuss some potential business impacts of hurricane season.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jason, for all that forecasting in context. So unfortunately, or maybe I should say expectedly at this point, there's going to be numerous potential business impacts in store for us for the 2021 hurricane season, especially as we look at something that's going to be more active than average. So for starters, we all know this, much of the US workforce is still working remotely or in some sort of hybrid situation, right? And that's not such a bad thing. I know a lot of us are taking advantage of that, but it does mean kind of new challenges for our employers as we're continuing into, you know, a new hurricane season. New people to protect in different positions, and then being able to effectively communicate with a workforce that's not necessarily right near your office and your company facilities all the time, right? We've really expanded those workforces. And the pandemic definitely raised that possibility for remote workers to move anywhere, and they did. We've seen this across our workforce. We've seen this across a bunch of our clients' workforces as well, employees that evaluated where they were and moved somewhere else, and now employers are having to evaluate where their people are, keep track of their people in different locations, and really make sure that they're assessing whether or not people in different locations are actually going to be impacted differently because they're in a different location for the hurricane season than they might traditionally be if they were working in an office. This is a really interesting slide. This is actually from the New York Times. And the data shows basically an unusually large flow of urban residents moving out of cities like New York and San Francisco to regions that I think we can all agree have a high share of jobs that can be done remotely, and jobs that are likely to stay remote post-pandemic, this period that we're kind of trending towards right now. And the number of people that actually moved to Texas and Florida in particular has been on the rise quite a bit. And of course, we all know that those are two states that see a lot of activity during the hurricane season. So more of a population moving to areas that are going to be more impacted generally by the hurricane season as we look ahead at that. And then just another really interesting fact that I wanted to share, the US Postal Service actually received 30 million change of address requests just in 2020 alone. I think we can probably all agree it's safe to say that that's a trend that we're going to continue to see going in that upward direction. So more people moving into that remote workforce, more companies having to analyze where people are, whether they're going to be in a different harm's way this year as opposed to previous years. So definitely something that all businesses are really going to need to consider, particularly in the Gulf and the East Coast this year. And then obviously, you know, we talked about this, location and employees these days, that's a major thing, but there's a lot of other potential business impacts that we're looking at for a traditional hurricane season, but also just, you know, as we continue to move forward in 2021 in particular. I'm really happy that Jason spent some time earlier talking about those inland effects. I do think that it's kind of a blind spot, excuse me, for some people to think, oh, I don't live on the coast or near the coast, so the storms aren't really necessarily going to impact me, or maybe I'll get a little bit of residual rain. But there's obviously a lot of other impacts to be considered. Fuel shortages is one, right, beyond the strength of the storm. They can really have treacherous impacts on the oil, gas, and the fuel industry, shortage of supplies after a hurricane. And this, of course, limits transportation, not just localized to those areas, but it can really have that trickle-down effect across the entirety of that supply chain and a lot of disruptions. Businesses also, you know, might not necessarily think about their suppliers and supply chain, but that's obviously a really big one. We talk a lot about supply chain now. We're having a lot of disruptions, not just in the US, but globally due to the pandemic. It sounds like we'll probably piggyback off that for a lot of the storm season this year. But when we think about our businesses, you know, most people tend to think about their physical, you know, locations, their facilities and things like that. Of course, your at-home workers and your remote workers and those that are in the office. But then really an extension that a lot of businesses need to strongly consider are their, you know, their distributors, people that actually, you know, support their business from afar and other business locations, and really acting like those are an extension of the business. Because obviously, if there's any sort of critical damage or any sort of critical impacts to one of your suppliers or distribution centers or people that are maybe a third party that you utilize all the time, that's almost just as important as things that might hit closer to home if it were your facility or a town where your people are located that's going to be hit. Power outages, obviously a big one that we see very much across the course of many years, but power outages have those trickle-down impacts as well. They might start out as power outages. Of course, if they go past, you know, a few hours or a few days, they can become really detrimental to communities, but they can also force retailers into cash-only scenarios. Cash isn't necessarily something a lot of us have on hand these days. I'm probably just as guilty as many. ATMs go down without electricity, so there's a lot of factors that need to be considered too as you're prepping for the season, and a lot of impacts that can happen just if, you know, the lights and the power go out for just even a few days. There's of course the loss of revenue and productivity. That obviously, you know, when we talk about supply chain, we talk about this kind of in the same grain. There's that trickle down effect. You know, a factory or a business might go down for maybe it's just a half a day or even 2 days, but there's that, you know, longevity of the impacts that can be felt from having things shut down for a while and having to get things back up and running, and just accounting for the time that it takes to really catch up, not only from a productivity standpoint, but then, you know, feeding into the supply chain and potentially to consumers as well. And then, you know,
and Sarah, just really quick, sorry to interrupt, but we have a kind of a question about that I thought would be a good time to bring up. Someone says, are there expected to be material and supply shortages that you need for the hurricane, like lumber, sandbags, chainsaws, things like that? Do you predict that as well?
So if you think about it right now, I think lumber is the biggest one that we all keep hearing about. New home prices are going up because lumber is, you know, it's a commodity that people aren't having an easy time coming by. Even just a few boards can cost hundreds of dollars these days. And the supply chain hasn't caught up during the pandemic. and during the rush on lumber. I definitely think that's something people need to consider going into hurricane season when you talk about boarding up businesses, potentially helping employees board up homes, helping to use lumber at different facilities for different reasons. It's definitely in short supply, and it's also obviously a higher price than it has been in year past, and something to consider as we're jumping into the season. I think lumber is probably the biggest one. We've seen the fuel shortages coming off of the hacking of the Colonial Pipeline, but that's another one that people should consider as we go into the season, and just stocking up, not hoarding. I don't encourage people to hoard, but obviously having enough things, on hand and in supply. But dependent upon where a hurricane strikes, we could see unanticipated impacts to supply chain and to products as well. I will, call this out right now. I don't think any one of us could have expected that at the beginning of the pandemic, there would be a rush on toilet paper of all things, right? So it's kind of expecting the unexpected. That's something that nobody really probably would have predicted or pointed to, but there definitely can be these impacts as we go into these seasons or as different areas are impacted for sure. Cool. And then just the last one, the funding and resource concerns. When we talk about hurricane season and the storms, inevitably that's a lot of doom and gloom, but there is some good news when we talk about funding. There's always a lot of concern about FEMA. Well, the Biden administration, just announced in late May that they're doubling their efforts on extreme weather events. They've also launched a new initiative with NASA for collection of better and more sophisticated weather data. Jason got at this in some of his earlier slides as well. The more sophisticated the data, the more predictive forecasters can be, the better we can prepare as businesses, as employees, and just as people that live in different areas. So that could truly be a game changer. And then as we talk about disaster relief, kind of a little plug here, but we have a podcast, and we've actually got a guest coming up who's talking about natural disasters next week. And one of the things that I think is just important to share in interesting context is, basically once you have a storm hit, you should anticipate, and our guest, pushes, you should anticipate 72 hours, following an event where you may not be able to get supplies to an area, supplies of all kinds. So think about that 3 days gap between being able to get supplies and necessities into an area. So just something else to kind of keep in mind as we continue to go through. And then Katie, I guess I'll pop it back to you. I know we've already had a few audience questions. They've been great ones so far. I'm sure we have a lot more. So I'll just pop it back to you to run through and moderate those.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, as we do dive into the Q&A, remember you can use the Q&A box to submit your questions if you haven't already. And we will answer as many as we can, but if for some reason we don't get to your question today, don't worry, we will follow up with you afterwards and make sure that you get the answers that you need. So, okay, Jason, a couple of people want to know specifically about hurricane hazards. So this is a two-part question. So what are some of the most common hurricane hazards that the average business should prepare for? And then what are some of the less common hazards that maybe most companies would not think about?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was kind of saying before, one of the big things that people will often first think about when it comes to hurricane are going to be those life-threatening winds. And that is certainly something that you want to prepare for. One of the better things and practices that you can do well ahead of a storm, and ideally before a hurricane season even rolls around, is to apply some sort of storm shutters along your business's windows, things like that, to get well ahead of any sort of impending weather activity. But one of the other major things that we should really focus on is going to be the threat from water. That's going to be a combination of your storm surge and also inland flooding as a result of river flooding via excessive rainfall and so on. It's really the water that is the dominant killer when it comes to hurricanes. You can really account for over 90% of the deaths within hurricanes, at least directly related to the actual tropical weather activity. It's related to water. So one of the things that I would often recommend is well in advance determine if your employees or your business or your own home is within a hurricane evacuation zone. Those will often be tailored towards where the areas of highest storm surge impact are going to be located. And to add to that, I would highly suggest to try to develop some sort of plan well in advance in the event that evacuation orders are called upon within that area. So, and actually I have a lot of experience with this just about living along the Gulf Coast for several years. I was part of having to deal with evacuations with my own family back in 1998 with Hurricane George, Hurricane Ivan in 2004, Hurricane Katrina, probably the most infamous one back in 2005. And one of the things that people have really gotten keen on within the last few years is they're really starting to take notice that with regard to lodging and expectations of being able to evacuate, you need to find where you're going to be well in advance. And a lot of hotels, they become booked up well north and away from the coastline. For example, hurricane landfalls along the central Gulf Coast can result in no vacancy all the way up into southern Arkansas. So if you can get ahead of things here, make those preparations well in advance, decide on if you're going to make the decision to leave, maybe even right before the mandatory evacuations are announced. If you have a good suspicion based on what we're seeing here with the latest forecast, at least have that plan in place and ready to implement.
And interesting,
I was just
oh, go
going to
ahead,
say,
Sarah.
I'll add one outlier. I know Jason and I have talked about this, and it's another one that I think people don't think about when they think about hurricanes. But I want to say I'm remembering the right storm. I think it was Hurricane Laura recently. The majority of the deaths that, you know, were as a result of Hurricane Laura were actually after the storm and due to generator use, basically people that were using generators and not using them in safe manners, so carbon monoxide poisoning. I think there were several deaths that came about after Laura, like I said, but just one of the things we see pushed very heavily in local communities when the storms are coming in is that generator safety. A lot of people, I think, are, you know, infrequent users of a generator, right? Both businesses and just people in residential communities that feel like they're being, you know, safe and savvy because they have a generator on hand. It's a great idea, but functionally not knowing how to use it can be incredibly dangerous as well. And unfortunately, it's been deadly in years past.
Yeah.
And, you know, piggybacking off of that, Sarah, we were talking to a meteorologist from the National Weather Service recently, and she said the same thing about chainsaw use. So the hurricane's gone, you know, you get out your chainsaw that you've never used before to take care of your tree limbs or whatever it is, and you end up getting hurt because it's the first time you've ever tried to use the chainsaw. So
Yeah.
Power tools, even like overexerting yourself in the heat for cleanup, just a bunch of cleanup injuries to be aware of post-storm.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on this a little bit more, Hurricane Hannah was another example just last year. It was the worst storm to hit South Texas since Dolly back in 2008. And in that case, there were no direct deaths with relation to the actual weather that took place because of advanced warning. The forecast was really good. But of the 5 indirect deaths, 4 were as a result of carbon monoxide poisoning. And unfortunately, one person fell off the ladder when he was working on his roof after the storm. So these are the types of things that we want to consider, avoid risk at all costs during these situations. And then another thing to also factor is to keep an eye on the elderly, because not only are we dealing with the physical impacts of the storm, but the psychological stress revolving around the evacuations, the damage to businesses and homes. And there is a lot of studies and research that show that there are more cardiovascular incidents during these storms. So there's a lot of medical related incidents because of the stress and physical factors involved with landfalling hurricanes.
It's a lot to think about. Oof. Well, Jason, you were mentioning evacuations before, and one of our attendees would like to know if you can explain contraflow lanes and when they might be activated during a hurricane.
Yeah, so contraflow is major lane reversal out of some of the bigger population centers. There's a lot of contraflow plans that are in place in the event that the worst case scenario happens. Usually they kind of center around major hurricane landfalls. So when you think about places like Houston, you have a metro area of over 7 million people. So we like to be really selective when it comes to issuing these contraflows, but basically they're there to evacuate mass quantities of people within a short period of time. But we want to be really careful that we don't cause another incident where we saw, for example, with Hurricane Rita back in 2005, where there were more deaths as a result of the evacuation compared to the actual storm itself. So the main emphasis when it comes to mandatory evacuations are going to be mainly along the coastal communities where the storm surge threat is going to be the highest. So you really want to pay attention to A, if you're in an evacuation zone, and B, what the official word is from the local authorities to make that decision if you really should evacuate. But contraflow, I would say that for the most part, that's a last case resort type situation. A lot of times that won't be until within about 36 to 40 hours prior to landfall. And another important thing to note is that once the tropical storm force winds begin to set in, even though that doesn't sound like too much of a big deal with 40-mile-per-hour winds, usually conditions will go downhill quite rapidly. And by that point, it's too late to evacuate. So the time would be as soon as they issue those orders, do it as soon as you possibly can, because you don't want to be caught up in gridlock traffic and you don't want to leave at the last minute.
That makes sense. Well, Sarah, we have a couple questions for you about the alert media global threat intelligence. So I'll kind of lump them all together here, and maybe you can give a general answer if that works for you.
Sure.
So someone wants to know if the global threat intelligence offering notifies when there's an impending hurricane. And then if so, does it only cover hurricanes in the Atlantic or everywhere? And
Okay.
why don't we start there?
Awesome. Okay, so backing up to alerting on impending hurricanes. So yes, there are a number of different things that you'll get from our team, Jason and others included when it comes to alert media and just kind of our alerting system. So Jason and his team actually include advanced warning and regional forecasting they do across the United States that's updated every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And that's where our customers get the most kind of advanced warning when tropical activity is happening, sometimes up to a week or more in advance, so that that very early tap on the shoulder, hey, there's something going on, you might want to start paying attention to this. And then once the systems form, we actually have a tropical layer on our dashboard that all of our admins have access to and can see. So obviously that real time, updating with the National Hurricane Center and NOAA as things are moved. And then Jason again and his team putting out very descriptive forecasting as the storm forecasting basically changes, projecting impacts, landfall, severity of storms and things like that. And then we also incorporate in our product the National Weather Service alerting. So obviously that's layered on, so very kind of localized alerting that you would see normally from the National Weather Service that kind of flows through our product. And then lastly, I know this is a lot, hurricanes are very big for us and for our customers, but we also on the global intelligence team obviously follow through on the back end with impacts. So you'll see power outages, you'll see evacuations that are happening during the midst, you'll see damage, just kind of major damage reports and things like that. So a whole litany of things that you would see from our team in those situations. Oh, and you asked about the Atlantic. I mean, I would say we talk about the Atlantic a lot. Jason can probably speak to this as well. And though we do talk about the Atlantic a lot because of the impacts, we definitely cover the full global scale of actually everything that's happening with tropical weather. So think not only about the Atlantic, think about the Pacific, the farther West Pacific. Just this year, we've been covering a lot of storms that have been happening off of, I know, Indonesia and India, a lot of cyclone activity there. So we're definitely a very large global operation, and we focus very heavily globally as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
I would say that just a few days ago, there was another storm that struck Vietnam. We had the alert out in effect for that region just to provide a tap on the shoulder to say, hey, there's likely to be a developing tropical storm. The main impacts are going to be heavy rainfall and flooding. And we had that alert out last week. So we're constantly surveilling the entire globe for any sort of impending tropical weather, no matter where it's located.
that makes sense. And then Sarah, just for clarity, so other data feeds can be merged into the weather notifications, right? Like maybe traffic or other emergency related notifications. They can get everything either at once or all together, right? They don't have to pick and choose like just weather notifications.
Exactly. So our tool is highly, customizable on the user end. Some people just leverage it for certain weather events. Some people are much more interested in what's going on in the tropics, while we have other clients who are very interested in tornadoes or flooding. So it's highly customizable on that front. But as you mentioned, it's obviously it goes beyond and customizable beyond weather as well. So understanding communications and technology outages that result from something like a hurricane or maybe some sort of other disruptive nature thing that happens, major traffic impacts and things like that fall into that category as well.
Perfect, thank you. And Jason, someone would like to know, what are some simple supplies that you recommend every business have on hand in preparation for a storm?
Yeah, certainly. So if you have those storm shutters or plywood well in advance, obviously that's going to be something for sure that you want to have at your disposal before there's the mad rush at Home Depot and Lowe's for sure. And I would also say that the generators are going to be of extreme importance. Main thing is to know how to operate these in advance. We don't want to have any more carbon monoxide incidents. Unfortunately, we think we learn our lesson each and every year, but we just continue to repeatedly see these things show up in the news after the storm has made landfall. You also want to make sure that you have enough fuel to supply that generator for potentially several days without power. And in worst case situations, some of these storms have been known to provide power outages that are widespread for weeks on end, especially if they impact a rather large area. So there could be an extended period where you need to think about where your employees are going to be, if they're going to be able to work remotely, and if so, how is the power outage situation going to be for their respective locations?
And how often do you recommend that companies have their buildings and infrastructures assessed for hurricane durability?
Well, I would say at minimum, at least once a year before the start of the season. You should really hire a professional contractor that knows some of the more vulnerable areas, especially with regard to roofing and things of that nature. Get an overall assessment. I would say, especially if your business or even your personal home hasn't been constructed within the last 5 years, have that contractor assess if it's up to code. Have there been better standards set in place in recent years, and maybe we can kind of shore up some weak spots. Certainly, those are things to consider. And I do have some concerns that after the Southeast US was battered so heavily last year, that there's still some vulnerabilities that we may not know about until we have a professional go out there and assess the situation. Even if you drive along I-10 along Louisiana, even to this current day, you'll notice a lot of tarps, blue tarps, still in place from prior storms last year.
Wow. Well, Sarah, this one's for you. What are some best practices for communicating with our people before, during, and after a hurricane?
Sure. I mean, I think probably one of the most important things, and just maybe a no-brainer to mention, is just having a process, right? So that your people, your employees, everybody across the organization understands where information is coming from. That can be an emergency communications platform. It can be some sort of internal portal, and a lot of, a number of different tools that can be used, but just setting expectations with employees across a business so that they understand where information is going to come from. The last thing you need during some sort of massive event like a hurricane is trying to create something, building the plane as you fly it. It's not necessarily the best practice in an emergency situation. I think probably great to just think of the end user, right? Think of any single employee and them understanding, okay, there's something happening. I understand where I'm going to get the information, how often I might get information, how often I might need to respond to information as well. So I just think, having a process and having a tool, whether it's something like we produce or whether it's something else or something done internally, I just think that's, obviously a huge thing when it comes to these sorts of events.
And what, are there ways that an organization could, survey their employees or check in with them during or after the storm to find out how they're doing, kind of make sure they're safe?
Definitely. So through our tool, we offer surveying, and I know you can do it through a number of different ways, but I would highly promote that. It's kind of the before, during, and after effect, right? You talk about storms and things like this in those three buckets. So before, maybe it's surveying employee base to understand where people are. We talked earlier about the disparate workforce. You may not know that some of your employees have moved to the Louisiana coast because they had family there. So deploying surveys like that ahead of time just to understand where people are and what their vulnerabilities might be. Obviously deploying things during a storm to understand people's safety. And then afterwards, this is more the duty of care for employers. But checking in on people's safety, but also checking in to see what people might need in a certain location.
Fantastic. And then what about COVID? We're still living in this COVID era. What are some best practices or standard operating procedures for hurricane planning during COVID?
Yeah, that's definitely a big one. I feel like everything in our lives has really kind of focused towards COVID, for better or for worse in recent years, right? I think my biggest advice to folks is to understand what's going on locally. I think we all see the landscape of the United States. Things are changing in locations so rapidly. So understanding what's happening locally at locations. I think we can talk bigger picture, and part of it, if you look at just, the landscape of the US, the number of cases and deaths is going down. That's a huge win. The number of people getting vaccinated is going up. That's causing a lot of joy for many, a lot more optimism. And I think it's good for us to be more optimistic. Obviously, there were a lot of challenges last hurricane season because of the pandemic, particularly with people sheltering or being, able to shelter or wanting to shelter with people that they did not know. Different sheltering sites had different parameters and regulations. It's definitely something to pay attention to. I think people will probably this year become a little bit more comfortable with going to the evacuation shelters, but I think it's also understanding the workforce, understanding people's comfort level of where they may want to go, or people that want to evacuate maybe even further, and giving them time to do so. And then the other big thing, we talked about this before, is supply chain, right? It's a little bit unpredictable what may happen as a result of a storm, but Jason mentioned some of the items people should stock up on. I mentioned earlier, I'm not suggesting that people hoard, but at the same time, it is good to be prepared, especially, you know, across the landscape right now, knowing that there's items that are already in short supply, but knowing that you will need to have things if a major storm hits your area, your business, and your people. So really taking considerations like that into account, because we are already feeling the tight squeeze of the supply chain. So making sure that those things are taken into consideration. I know that, again, I just lean back on the shelters. A lot of the local shelters will have their own parameters around, number one, how many people are going to be allowed in. I expect that it will be a lot more, you know, fluid these days, but probably more people that can actually be accommodated more at the shelters. It's a great thing, but also understanding that there's, you know, definitely steps that people will need to take as, you know, part of a population that might be in a shelter, or again, people that aren't necessarily wanting to do that and may want to evacuate to another location.
Got it. And we have time for one more question, and I just find this one fascinating. So Jason, this is for you. During Hurricane Harvey in Houston, we were told to evacuate due to rising floodwaters from the hurricane, but then we're told minutes later to shelter in place because the hurricane had sprung tornadoes. How do you recommend that we react or prioritize multiple hurricane hazards at once?
Well, that's a terrific and at the same time loaded question, and it's a good question to ask, and it's something that we definitely deal with regard to social science, in addition to just forecasting the weather, because it's one thing to know what the weather is going to do, but it's another thing to be able to convey it in a way where people know the appropriate action to take. So this kind of coincides with proper preparation before the hurricane ever arrives. Hurricanes are a multifaceted threat. By far the biggest danger is going to be winds, the flooding associated with heavy rainfall. The winds are more of a secondary risk. So at the same time, however, you need to account for where you're going to be before that storm ever makes it to the coast. If you are in a low-lying area, storm surge prone area, or an area that's just, it has a history of having inland excessive rainfall and flooding, I would advise you to find a better shelter before the storm ever gets to that point. And then you also want to make sure that at least there is enough security in the event that a tornado warning is issued amidst all of the heavy rain and flooding, because the last thing that I would ever want someone to do is try to choose a different location in the middle of a hurricane when you're surrounded by floodwaters. You really need to prioritize the threat of heavy rainfall and flooding, know where you're going to be before the floodwater arrives. And then with regard to tornadoes and hurricanes, it's definitely not a threat that needs to be dismissed by any means. You need to respect the polygon anytime a tornado warning polygon is issued for your area, but people can take at least slight comfort in knowing that tornadoes only account for about 3% of the fatalities within hurricanes. And a lot of times the tornadoes are rather short-lived. So within just a matter of minutes after a warning is issued, there's a good chance that the expiration will be coming soon after. Again, respect the tornado warning polygon, but I would definitely prioritize the flooding and avoid the flooding by any means possible, really.
That's fantastic advice. And what an awful situation to find yourself in, honestly.
Sure.
Well, we have a couple of folks asking about resources. So we do have a slide on that coming up. So I'm not going to have Jason speak to it just right now, but just know that we have some coming, and then we'll be sending out this deck as well as a link to this webinar recording where you can find those. So that is all the time that we have for questions today. So I really appreciate everyone who submitted a question. And thank you to Jason and Sarah for providing that info. But before we wrap up, I do want to just poll our audience one last time. So Dawn, if you want to go ahead and launch that. And this is just to gauge your interest in learning more about alert media. So basically, if you want to know how alert media can help with your hurricane preparedness or your communications, you can let us know that. And if you are interested in finding out more, we will happily follow up with you afterwards. So I'm just going to give this another couple seconds. Okay, we can go ahead and close that one out. And then again, I just wanted to thank Jason Moreland and Sarah Pratley for being here with us today and for sharing their insights and expertise. So Jason, if anyone would like to follow up with you afterwards with additional questions or just to pick your brain, how can they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have any detailed weather-related questions or even hurricane preparedness, feel free to send me an email at any time, jason.moreland@alertmedia.com. I'm also accessible on LinkedIn, so don't hesitate. Go ahead and send me a message right away. I'll be very willing to get back to you.
And Sarah, what about you?
Same here. My email address is on the screen there, sarah.pratley@alertmedia, and happy to take people on LinkedIn as well. Always happy to help people prepare for these sorts of situations.
Wonderful. Well, as promised, here are some resources that Jason recommends to help you stay up to date on any hurricane developments. So it is important to check these resources regularly and during hurricane season, daily, maybe even several times a day, depending on your situation. And again, we will be sending these out to you guys, so no need to try and frantically write them down right now. You'll be able to look them over at your leisure. And that concludes our presentation today. So hopefully everyone feels a little bit more prepared for this year's above average hurricane season.